Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. The whole family was shocked when the lawyer revealed the person they had long disrespected was actually their benefactor. My name is Maggie Lawson. 71, a widow who has been living quietly in my son's house, and during an ordinary dinner I heard my daughter-in-law laugh that the old woman lives here for free. I swallowed the taste of sawdust and called my lawyer, and 2 days later he laid $158,400 of mortgage receipts on their coffee table and revealed that the person they had long disrespected was me. When I stopped paying, the lender called an audit, opened at my son's firm lawsuits, found my daughter-in-law, and I walked out with a key to Riverside Oaks and a life that finally belonged to me. The roast chicken on my plate had already cooled by the time I lifted my fork. The dining room was bright polished wood shining under the chandelier, but the air felt thick as if every breath had to be forced. I sat across from my son David, who was still in his work shirt with his tie loosened, scrolling on his phone between bites. To his right sat Stephanie, my daughter-in-law, her hair perfectly curled as always, a glass of wine in hand. Beside her, Rachel had joined us for dinner, again the younger sister, who seemed to spend more nights here than in her own apartment. Stephanie's voice carried into the dining room from the kitchen as she finished a call. I heard her laugh, sharp and dismissive, then her words cut through me. That old woman lives here for free and still acts like she deserves respect. The words landed like a slap. I froze fork halfway to my mouth, my hand trembling just enough to rattle the plate. Rachel let out a low chuckle, clearly amused. David said nothing. He didn't even look up. I lowered my gaze quickly, pretending not to hear, though my ears burned. I pressed the chicken against the tines of my fork, forcing it into my mouth, chewing mechanically. The flavor was gone. All I could taste was sawdust. My chest tightened, and I swallowed hard to keep the lump in my throat from showing. Stephanie re-entered, slipping her phone into her pocket. A sugary smile spread across her face. "Dinner smells great, doesn't it, Maggie?" I nodded, forcing a smile that felt stiff. "Yes, it does." Rachel glanced at me and smirked. Her eyes sparkled with a hint of cruelty, like a child who has discovered a secret and enjoys dangling it over someone's head. She reached for the bread basket and said to Stephanie in a casual tone, "I could really get used to meals like this. If only there was more room in the house." Stephanie gave her a quick look, a silent agreement passing between them. Then she turned back to her plate, sipping her wine without another word. I wanted to stand up to slam my fork down and demand to know how they could treat me this way after everything I had done. Instead, I lifted my water glass to my lips. My hand shook slightly as I tried to steady them, the ice clinking against the rim. I swallowed the cool water, willing my heartbeat to slow. David looked up briefly, his brow furrowed, then quickly returned to his phone as if hiding behind its glow. He did not defend me. He did not ask what his wife meant. His silence was louder than any insult. The conversation at the table drifted back to Rachel's day. She talked about the office temp job she had quit after only 3 weeks, complaining about long hours and demanding supervisors. Stephanie nodded, barely listening, while David ate quietly. I kept my eyes on the chicken, cutting small pieces, chewing, swallowing, doing anything to keep my expression neutral. Every clink of fork against plate felt magnified in my ears. The laughter of the two sisters blended into the background like a cruel chorus. I sat in the same chair I had used every night for years, yet suddenly I felt like a stranger in this house. When Stephanie refilled her glass of wine, she leaned back in her chair and let out a sigh of satisfaction. "This house really is beautiful," she said. "Sometimes I forget how lucky we are." Rachel grinned and replied, "Well, it won't be just yours forever." Houses this size don't stay this way. Families change, people move out. Their eyes flicked to me for only a moment, quick and sharp, before turning back to each other. I pressed my fork against the meat again, forcing another bite. My jaw ached from clenching, but I kept chewing, kept swallowing. My throat felt raw. The walls of the dining room held framed photos of family holidays. David as a child with Harold, my late husband smiling wide with his arm around him, me holding a cake for his 16th birthday. All those moments of love and sacrifice stared back at me, now blurred by the sting in my eyes. Stephanie wiped her lips with a napkin and stood up. "I'll clear the dishes in a bit," she said lightly. "Don't worry about it." Rachel leaned toward her sister, whispering something I couldn't catch. They both laughed softly. I sat perfectly still, back straight, hands folded in my lap, as if the smallest movement would betray the storm inside me. The meal continued, words and laughter swirling around me as if I were invisible. I kept my head down, nodding when spoken to, forcing out a polite yes or no when needed. Inside, though, something shifted. For 3 years, I had endured the subtle digs, the casual exclusions, the way my belongings were left in storage, while my presence was tolerated like an afterthought. I had told myself it was temporary, that silence was the cost of peace. But tonight, hearing Stephanie's cruel words, seeing Rachel's smirk, feeling David's silence pressing down heavier than all of it, I knew something had broken. I pushed the last piece of chicken across my plate untouched. My chest ached, but not from age, not from fatigue. It ached from disappointment, from betrayal, from the realization that even here in my son's house I was not welcome. I lifted my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and folded it neatly beside my plate. I took another sip of water, steadying myself. My hands no longer trembled. I would not confront them now, not tonight. There was no point in shouting into deaf ears, but I knew as clearly as I had ever known anything in my life that my silence would not last much longer. I raised my eyes, let them sweep once more across the table, across the faces of the people who should have been my family, who had instead become strangers in my own story. Then I lowered my gaze again, finishing the last swallow of water, and kept my lips pressed together. Inside, the decision had already been made. When I finally lay in bed that night, the ceiling above me seemed lower than usual, pressing down with memories I had tried to keep folded away. The quiet hum of the air conditioner reminded me of a different kind of quiet, the stillness of the farmhouse Harold and I once called home. I closed my eyes and let myself drift back to that morning in April of 2015 when everything had changed. Harold had always been an early riser. That day he had kissed my cheek, laced up his old boots, and walked out to mend a section of fencing on the back field. It was routine, nothing unusual. I was brewing coffee when the neighbor came running to the door, panic etched on his face. By the time I reached the hospital, it was too late. A heart attack, sudden and merciless. He was 73, and in one moment I was no longer a wife, but a widow. The days that followed blurred into paperwork casseroles from neighbors, and a silence so loud it rattled in my bones. Our farmhouse stood strong red brick with a wide porch, but every corner held Harold's presence. I tried to sleep in our bed, but his absence hollowed it out. Eventually, I admitted to myself that I could not live there alone. I sold it a few months later. The sale brought in more than I expected. The land had grown in value and buyers were eager. With the mortgage cleared, I walked away with enough to last me, or so I thought. In 2017, David called one evening, his voice tight. He tried to sound calm, but I knew his tone. The adjustable mortgage on their new colonial house had jumped. Interest rates had crept higher, and the payment was choking them. Stephanie had just opened her design studio downtown, and clients were scarce. He said they were making it work, but I heard the strain. I could not bear to watch my son sink beneath numbers on a ledger. He had always been proud like Harold, never willing to admit when the weight was too much. I contacted James Whitaker, Harold's oldest friend, a lawyer with kind eyes who had guided us through Harold's will. We met in his office, the smell of leather books and old wood settling me like an anchor. I told him I wanted to help David and Stephanie without their knowledge. I asked him to set up a trust account, one that would transfer directly to the bank each month, covering their mortgage. James leaned back, hands folded, and studied me. He warned me that secrets have a way of hurting even when they are meant to heal. I shook my head. David would never accept it if he knew. This way they could feel secure, as if they were carrying the load themselves, while I carried it quietly behind the curtain. $2,200 each month. I signed the documents, arranged the automatic transfers, and walked out with a mix of relief and apprehension. That first month when the payment cleared, I felt as if Harold were beside me, nodding, telling me I had done the right thing. The months became years. Each withdrawal from my account was a reminder of my silent promise. By the time 6 years had passed, I had paid $158,400, a number I kept locked inside like a secret too heavy to share. My savings shrank, but I told myself it was worth it. There were moments when I nearly confessed. When David thanked me casually for staying with them and said it helped with expenses, my throat tightened with the truth I swallowed back. When Stephanie bragged about managing the mortgage despite her growing business debts, I clenched my hands under the table. I wanted to shout that it was me, that I was the one keeping the roof over their heads. But pride can cut both ways. David's pride in believing he was providing. My pride in carrying the burden without recognition. I remembered the day I cleared out the farmhouse. I had boxed up Harold's tools, his books, his old rocking chair, and stored them away, thinking someday they would have a place in David's home. Stephanie had told me she would figure out how to incorporate them later. That was 3 years ago. The boxes remained in storage, gathering dust, waiting for a moment that never came. At night, I would sometimes sit with the checkbook in my lap, running my finger over the numbers, calculating how many months more I could sustain this silent generosity. It was not just money. It was years of my life given away piece by piece. Every payment was a sacrifice of freedom, of independence, of the chance to live somewhere that was truly mine. Lying there in that small guest room, I thought about Harold again. He had once told me that love was not about grand gestures, but about steady choices, about showing up. For 6 years I had shown up in the only way I knew how. But now, after what I heard at the dinner table, his words felt twisted. Had my steady choice turned me into a doormat instead of a partner in their success? I pressed my palms flat against the blanket, breathing slowly. The numbers lined up in my head: 6 years, $2,200 each month, $158,400 in total. More than the value of some houses in this city. I had given them security. In return, I had been reduced to a nuisance, a shadow at their table. The memory of Stephanie's laugh echoed in my ears. That old woman lives here for free. The words cut deeper now that I replayed the ledger in my mind. Free. Nothing about this had ever been free. Every month had cost me more than money. It had cost me dignity. I turned onto my side, staring at the outline of the boxes stacked against the wall. Inside, one of them was the quilt my mother had stitched when I married Harold. In another was his wristwatch, the one he wore every day for 40 years. They remained locked away, unseen, unvalued, while I lived as a guest in a house I had paid for. For the first time, I wondered if silence was not noble but foolish. Maybe I had mistaken sacrifice for love, and in doing so had erased myself. The clock on the nightstand ticked toward midnight. I closed my eyes, the weight of all those years pressing down until it was hard to breathe. The truth sat in my chest like a stone, and for the first time I felt it shift. Perhaps it was not mine to carry any more. I whispered Harold's name into the dark, my voice shaking. If you can see me, if you know what I have done, tell me it mattered. Tell me I was not wrong. The silence that followed was answer enough. I rolled onto my back, pulling the blanket higher, and stared once more at the ceiling. The house around me was silent, but inside my mind the numbers kept repeating 6 years, 2,200 each month, 158,400 in total. I thought of David's silence at the table, of Stephanie's smirk, of Rachel's laugh. A bitter taste rose in my mouth. Sacrifice had become something else, something heavier than I had ever intended. I could not help but wonder if my gift meant as love had only chained me to their disregard. That question lingered in the dark as I closed my eyes, uncertain of the answer, certain only that the life I had built in secrecy no longer felt like a blessing. The next morning I rose earlier than usual, restless from a night of fractured sleep. The air in the guest room felt heavy, carrying the scent of old paint and the faint mustiness that clung to walls never truly mine. I straightened the bed as I always did, tucking the corners carefully, a small ritual of order in a world that felt increasingly unstable. On the dresser sat the same framed photograph of Harold and David, frozen in a happier time. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger and whispered to Harold that I was tired, though no one but me could hear. Downstairs the house was already alive. I heard the clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, and Rachel's laugh cutting through the air like a bell. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen. Stephanie was pouring coffee, her nails clicking against the pot. Rachel leaned against the counter, dressed in yoga pants, holding a piece of toast she had barely touched. They stopped talking when I entered, though the smirk on Rachel's face told me that whatever the subject had been, I would not have liked it. "Good morning," I said, steady but quiet. Stephanie smiled thinly. "Morning, Maggie. Coffee's fresh if you want some." Rachel's eyes flicked toward me as she said, "Lakeside Terraces had an open house yesterday. They had models staged with the most incredible views. You could see the whole city from the balcony." Stephanie gave a short laugh, glancing at her sister before looking back at her mug. "We deserve that. This house has been good to us, but it won't be forever." Rachel bit into her toast, still watching me. "Families change," she said. "People move out. Nothing stays the same." The words stung more because she never looked away. I poured a half cup of coffee and took it to the small kitchen table, keeping my head down. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the cup to my lips. David entered a moment later, briefcase already in hand, his shirt pressed but his eyes tired. He kissed Stephanie on the cheek, nodded at Rachel, and gave me only a quick glance. "Morning, Mom. Be sure to lock the back door if you go out." Then he was gone. The sound of the door closing behind him more final than it should have been. His absence left a silence I could not fill. For a long moment I stared at the door, hoping he would come back, maybe to ask how I was, or just to notice me. But the only sound was Rachel humming softly and Stephanie scrolling through her phone. I spent the late morning in the living room, folding laundry, lining up neat stacks on the sofa. Stephanie passed by twice, speaking to Rachel on speakerphone about her design studio, complaining about clients who changed their minds or delayed payments. Each time she walked through, she hardly glanced at me. The mantel above the fireplace caught my eye again, filled with photographs of vacations, birthdays, and family gatherings. I was not in a single one of them. In the afternoon, I tried to read in my room, but the voices downstairs carried through the walls. Rachel's laugh again, then Stephanie's lower voice, more serious. I set my book aside and moved closer to the door, my breath caught in my throat. "If we sell soon, we'll get top dollar," Rachel said. "Lakeside is booming." "Exactly," Stephanie replied. "I've been looking at units online. They have everything: concierge service, fitness center, even a rooftop garden." Rachel's voice rose with excitement. "And with Maggie out of the picture, you could finally enjoy it." My chest tightened. Stephanie's words followed sharper this time. "She's not going to be here forever. Once she's gone, we can move on." I pressed my hand against the door frame to keep myself steady. Their voices blurred after that, talking about layouts, pricing, and furniture choices. Every detail felt like another reminder that their vision of the future had no place for me. I backed away from the door and sat heavily on the bed, my legs shaking. My belongings in storage flashed in my mind. Harold's watch, my mother's quilt, the rocking chair Harold had repaired with his own hands. All of it locked away unseen, just like me. Dinner that evening was pasta with a jarred sauce, but Stephanie presented it as though she had created a masterpiece. Rachel gushed about the flavor, sipping wine with exaggerated appreciation. David twirled his fork in silence, his eyes on the plate, his mind elsewhere. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Imagine the guest room there, Steph. It will be mine whenever I want it." Stephanie laughed, nodding as she lifted her glass. "Of course." David chuckled weakly, saying nothing more. I sat quietly, pushing pasta around my plate, the weight in my chest heavier than the food before me. Later, I climbed the stairs slowly, the house dim behind me. In my room, I opened the window to let in the night air. The street below was alive with ordinary sounds: a dog barking, a car engine starting, the faint hum of music from a passing car. All of it reminded me that life continued outside these walls, while I remained trapped inside them. I lay down, but could not sleep. My mind replayed the conversation about lakeside terraces, the laughter, the casual dismissal of my existence. I pictured the towers again, glass gleaming under the Charlotte skyline, a symbol of everything they wanted and everything that excluded me. I turned onto my side, clutching the blanket. Silence had once been my way of keeping the peace, of giving David and Stephanie the chance to stand tall without feeling indebted. But now it had become something else. It had erased me little by little until even my place at the dinner table felt like a chair for a stranger. The bitterness rose in my mouth, heavier than before. I closed my eyes, knowing that if I continued like this, silence would not protect me. It would finish erasing me entirely. The morning arrived, gray and unsettled clouds, stretching across the Charlotte sky as if they carried the same heaviness I felt in my chest. I rose earlier than usual, dressing quietly so as not to wake anyone else in the house. The guest room seemed smaller than ever as I looked around one last time before leaving. My bag was already packed with the necessary papers, my checkbook, and the notebook where I had written every mortgage payment since 2017. Neat columns of numbers that told the story of 6 lost years. I slipped down the stairs and out the front door without breakfast. The air outside was sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain on asphalt. I walked to my car parked at the edge of the driveway and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, forcing my hands to stop shaking. I whispered Harold's name once softly, then started the engine. The drive across town took me through familiar streets, lined with oak trees whose leaves had just begun to turn. Children waited with backpacks at bus stops, and joggers moved steadily along the sidewalks. Life carried on with its small rhythms, while I prepared to unravel the secret that had defined mine for nearly a decade. James Whitaker's office was housed in an old brick building downtown, its brass plaque shining faintly under the pale light. I had walked through those doors many times over the years, first with Harold to draw up our will, later to sell the farm after his death. This time, though, my purpose felt heavier. The receptionist greeted me warmly, her voice gentle as she led me down the hall. James's office smelled of leather and polished wood, a place of order and permanence. He rose as I entered, his tall frame slightly stooped now, but his presence steady. His kind eyes studied me as I sank into the chair opposite his desk. "Maggie," he said, "what troubles you today?" I pressed my purse into my lap, struggling to find words. Last night I heard them. Stephanie and Rachel. They were laughing about selling the house, about buying a condo at Lakeside Terraces, about how perfect life would be once I was gone. James's jaw tightened, though his expression stayed calm. My voice shook, but I forced myself to continue. "For 6 years I've paid that mortgage. $2,200 every month, $158,400 in total. I sold my farm. I gave up the home Harold and I built together. And for what, to be mocked as if I were some freeloader who should be grateful for scraps of space in my son's house." The words broke loose sharper than I intended. I pressed a tissue to my eyes, but the tears kept falling. They think I live there for free. They think I am nothing more than a burden. James leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his voice quiet. "I warned you once, Maggie. Secrets, even the kind meant to protect, often become chains." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You were right. I see that now. I thought I was preserving David's pride, sparing him the shame of needing help. But all I've done is erase myself." The office grew silent except for the ticking of the old clock on his wall. I folded the tissue neatly, steadied my voice, and said what I had been rehearsing in my head all night. "I want to stop the payments, James. Effective immediately." He sat back, eyes narrowing slightly as if to test the weight of my decision. "Are you certain ending the transfers will mean the next mortgage payment goes unpaid? There will be questions, possibly consequences." "Yes." My answer was firm. I cannot continue. Every dollar I send feels like I am feeding the very people who despise me. I need it to end. James regarded me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I will contact the bank. The automatic transfers will be halted before the next payment date." Relief rushed through me, sharp and dizzying, but there is more, I added quickly. "I want them to know all of it. Every dollar, every month. I want you to bring the documents and show them exactly what I have done." His brows lifted slightly. "You want me to confront them directly?" "Yes. If I try to explain, they will dismiss it as exaggeration or spite. Coming from you with the paperwork, they cannot deny it." James closed the folder in front of him and placed his hand over it. "If this is what you want, I will stand beside you. But Maggie, you must prepare yourself. The truth may shock them, but it will not necessarily bring gratitude." I drew in a breath steadier than I expected. I am not seeking gratitude. I just want the truth to live outside my chest for once. He studied me, then gave a slow nod. "I will arrange the documents and come to the house later this week. You need not stand alone in that room." "Thank you, James." My voice cracked on the words. He softened his tone, almost fatherly. "Harold would be proud of you, you know. Proud that you carried so much, though he would tell you to put some of it down now." The mention of Harold's name broke something inside me. I covered my mouth, sobbing once, then pressed the tissue harder to my eyes. For years, I had carried the weight alone, but here in this office, I finally allowed myself to set it down. When the tears subsided, I rose slowly. James shook my hand firmly, his grip warm and steady. "We will do this carefully, Maggie. The truth will be spoken." I walked back through the quiet hallway, each step lighter than the one before. Outside, the clouds had shifted, sunlight breaking through in scattered beams. The breeze touched my face softer now, almost like Harold's hand brushing away my tears. I crossed the parking lot and paused at my car, looking up at the wide sky. For the first time in years, I felt a thread of control weaving back into my hands. The silence that had erased me was ending. The truth at last would speak for itself. I opened the car door and slid into the seat, resting my palms on the steering wheel. My heart was still heavy, but in its weight, there was also a strange calm. I had given enough. Too much. No more. As I started the engine and pulled out onto the street, the city around me bustled with its ordinary rhythm. Yet something had changed. For the first time since Harold's passing, I felt that my life was no longer a shadow drifting behind others. It was mine again, fragile but real, and I intended to hold on to it. 2 days later, I stood in the foyer and listened to the quiet tick of the wall clock while the afternoon sun washed the hardwood in a soft glow. The house felt staged cushions puffed and candles unlit, as if the room were waiting for someone to judge it. David paced between the fireplace and the window, one hand in his pocket, the other rubbing his forehead. Stephanie sat rigid in the armchair nearest the door, legs crossed, arms folded, chin lifted in that practiced way she used when she expected to be offended. Rachel had taken the edge of the sofa, restless fingers tapping a rhythm on her phone, even when the screen was dark. The doorbell chimed and David went to answer. James Whitaker stepped inside with the same measured calm I had seen in his office briefcase in his left hand, a simple nod for each of us. He greeted David first, then me, then offered a courteous hello to Stephanie and Rachel. His presence steadied the space like weight added to a table that had been wobbling. We settled without ceremony. James set his briefcase on the coffee table, unlatched it, and drew out a thick folder, a slim binder, and a single envelope. David hovered beside the sofa, then finally sank down next to Rachel, eyes never leaving the documents. Stephanie shifted and crossed her legs the other way, the leather of the chair creaking softly. I sat on the opposite end of the couch, hands clasped together to keep them still. James said that he was here at my request. He spoke evenly, each sentence placed with care as if he were setting stones across a stream. He said that beginning in January of 2017, monthly mortgage payments on this property had been made from a trust account he managed on my behalf. He said the amount was $2,200 per month paid on or before the due date, and that the total to date was $158,400. He slid the binder toward David and rested 2 fingers on the top page. Bank confirmations, transfer receipts, and the original authorization were all included. The room held its breath. David reached for the binder, lifted the first page, and scanned it. His lips parted. He flipped to the next page, then another faster now, fingers skimming dates and amounts. A slip of paper slid loose and drifted to the floor. He bent to pick it up and his hand shook so hard he dropped it again. He let it lie there and looked at me as if he had never seen me before. Stephanie made a small sound, not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp. She leaned forward and said that this was absurd. She said that we had always made our payments. She said that perhaps there was a misunderstanding, that perhaps I was exaggerating what I had done. The last word hung in the air like a gnat. Rachel did not smirk this time. Her face had gone still, her eyes darting between the pages and my hands. She said softly that the numbers were all there. She said that the totals matched the monthly payment they claimed to be making. David found his voice. He said that he did not understand. He said he had always transferred the money from their checking to a holding account. James nodded and said that was correct, that funds had been moved into a household account each month, but that the lien holder had received payment from the trust, not from the household account. He turned a page to show the split trail. He pointed to the line where the lender credited the trust transfer. He said the structure had been designed to preserve privacy at my request. Stephanie pressed her palm flat against the armrest and said that no one had asked me to do this, that no one had demanded such a sacrifice. Her voice sharpened on the word sacrifice, as if it were something vulgar. She said that if I had chosen to spend my money in this way, that was on me. James did not look at her. He said only that the records were accurate. He said that I had requested discretion because my son would not have accepted the help if he had known. He said that the trust had acted according to that instruction and that the lender had accepted every payment without issue. David turned to me, then eyes bright, voice rough at the edges. He said that he wished I had told him. He said that he would have found another way. He said that he had been trying to be a good provider and that now he could see how little he had actually seen. The words stumbled, stacked on top of one another, then fell into silence. I told him that I had wanted him to stand tall. I told him that I had hoped the safety net would let him breathe, that pride would not be crushed under debt. I told him that I had believed I could carry the weight quietly and that love would make it lighter. I felt the heat rise in my face and steadied my breath. I told him that love had not made it lighter when contempt had been added to the load. Stephanie sat back and crossed her arms tighter. She said that she had never asked me to move in, that she had only agreed to help family in need. She said that if I was unhappy, that was my choice. She said that plenty of mothers lived in senior communities and did just fine. James laid a single page on the table, the one with the total highlighted clearly. He spoke again in that even tone. He said that the arrangement had ended. He said that the automatic transfer had been halted at my direction and that the lender would expect payment from the household before the next due date. He let the words settle. The clock ticked on. Rachel shifted first. She reached down, picked up the paper that had fallen, and slid it back on top of the pile. She said nothing. Her hands would not keep still. David stared at the total again. He pressed his fingers to his eyes as if he could rub away the number. He said that he was sorry in a voice so small it sounded like a child. He said that he did not know how to make this right. I told him that I was not asking him to undo 6 years or repay 6 years. I told him that I did not need thanks or a speech. Across the room, Stephanie exhaled loudly. Rachel glanced at her and then looked away. The air felt thin in my lungs, but my back was straight. I looked at each of them in turn. I said the words that had lived in my chest for too long. I said that I had never needed to be called a benefactor. I said that I only wanted respect. The line landed like a stone dropped into deep water. There was no splash, only the slow pull downward into whatever lay beneath. David reached for my hand and held it, his grip clumsy and tight. He said that he had failed me. He said that he had failed Harold. He said that he had failed himself. I squeezed his fingers and told him to breathe. I told him we would speak later, just the two of us. Stephanie pulled her shoulders back and lifted her chin again. She said that none of this changed the fact that they had their own plans, that they were on the verge of a new chapter, that they would handle their affairs from now on. Her voice wavered only once, a thin thread that snapped quickly. James closed the folder and slid it back into the briefcase, but left the copies on the table. He said that his role today was to present the facts. He said that any decisions about repayment or acknowledgement were entirely up to the family. He said that I had asked for transparency, and that transparency had now been given. Rachel stood and moved toward the window as if she needed more air. She pressed her hand to the glass and stared at the street, where the late sun turned parked cars into lines of burnished metal. She said quietly that she had not known. It sounded almost like an apology, but she did not turn around. The room grew quieter still. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere on the block, steady and indifferent. Inside, the truth sat on the coffee table in neat stacks, too heavy for anyone to lift. I let my hand fall from David's and folded both hands in my lap again. I could feel my pulse settling, not calm, but no longer racing headlong. The fear that had lived under my ribs for so long was still there, yet something had shifted. The secret no longer owned me. James stood and offered a slight nod to each of us. He said that he would see himself out unless anyone had questions. No one spoke. He clasped my shoulder gently as he passed a brief pressure that said more than words could carry. When the door closed behind him, the house did not move. David stared at the papers. Stephanie stared at me. Rachel kept her eyes on the glass and the street beyond it. I drew in a breath and let it out slowly. The room, the house, the years, all of it felt different now, as if the floorboards had shifted under our feet. No one reached for the binder again. No one reached for an apology that could cover the gap. We sat with the sound of the clock and the distant mower and the facts between us. I felt tired all the way through, but in that tiredness there was a steady core I had not felt in years. I had spoken the truth into the space where my silence used to live. David leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and covered his face with both hands. His breath came in short, uneven pulls as if he had been running. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet and startled, the way a child looks after waking from a bad dream. He said he was sorry. He said the word again, then again, each time quieter, as if he were trying to fill a space that could not be filled. He said he should have seen me. He said he should have asked more questions instead of assuming the house carried itself. Stephanie shifted in her chair and the leather creaked sharply. She said there was nothing to apologize for. She said no one had forced me to pay anything. She said if I wanted to spend my money to feel important, that was my business. Her chin lifted as if she wanted the words to sting more than they did. Rachel rose from the sofa and walked to the window. She crossed her arms and stared at the street shoulders tense under her sweater. She said she needed air and then did not move. The late sun lit the side of her face, and I saw that the bravado that usually played around her mouth had drained away. James cleared his throat softly. He had not sat back down after closing his briefcase. He stood near the doorway, patient and still, and when he spoke, his voice was even and low. He said there were two things the family needed to understand. First, that the payments had in fact been made by me through the trust without fail since 2017. Second, that I had legal options now that the arrangement had ended. He said a court could treat the money as a loan. He said a court could require repayment or impose a lien to secure it. He added that none of that was inevitable. It would happen only if I chose to pursue it. David stared at James as if the words were written on the air. He asked what repayment would even look like. He said their accounts were tight. He said his stomach had been in a knot for months. His voice trailed off like a frayed thread. Stephanie snapped that this was exactly the problem. She said the whole thing felt like a setup. She said I had kept secrets for years, and now I was waving them in their faces to make them feel small. She said if respect was what I wanted, I should have acted like family and told the truth from the beginning. I felt the old urge to defend myself rise in my throat and forced it back. I said I had kept quiet because I believed it would let David breathe. I said I thought sparing his pride would help his marriage. I said I had misjudged what silence becomes when it is mistaken for weakness. My voice did not shake. That surprised me. Rachel spoke without turning from the window. She said she had not known, and that some of the things she had said had been careless. She let the last word hang there, and I could tell she meant more than careless. But careless was all she could manage. James moved a step closer to the coffee table. He placed one hand lightly on the binder as if it were a living thing that needed calming. He said in the absence of any request from me, there would be no legal action. He said we were having this conversation so that everyone could stand on the same ground. He said the lender would expect a payment next month and that the trust would not make it. David turned to me then, and his voice lost the strained formality he used at work. He said, "Tell me what you want me to do." He said, "I cannot change the last 6 years, but I can do better from this moment on." He took a breath and waited. Really, waited the way you wait when you are ready to hear whatever comes. I told him I did not want a courtroom. I did not want a ledger balanced or a ceremony of thanks. I said I wanted a boundary. I wanted the truth to be allowed to stand in the room without being shoved into a dark corner. I said I wanted to live somewhere I could exhale and not feel like a trespasser in my own life. Stephanie let out a sound that was part laugh and part scoff. She said that sounded dramatic. She said plenty of mothers chose senior living by choice and found it charming. She said this house had never been the right fit for me, and perhaps now we were all seeing it clearly. David looked at her with a mix of surprise and something like fear. He said he had never asked me how I felt because he had been afraid of the answer. He said he had chosen the path of least resistance every time a small cruelty landed on the table. He said he was ashamed of that. He grew quiet and swallowed hard. Rachel finally turned from the window. She walked back to the sofa and sat on the edge again, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. She said, "What happens now?" She was looking at James, but she kept glancing at me. James answered the practical part first. He said the next payment was due in 3 weeks. He said the lender would contact the household if it was missed. He said the trust would not intervene. He added that if I ever wished to formalize a separation of finances or living arrangements, he would assist. Then he looked at me directly and asked if I wanted to make any request of them. I shook my head. My request was already in the room. It lay on the table in the stack of confirmations and in the space between us that those confirmations had opened. I said I did not want their money. I said I wanted to stop pretending. The air shifted then, subtle but real. David rubbed his hands over his face and let them fall into his lap. He said again that he was sorry, but the word no longer tried to cover the gap. It simply acknowledged it. Stephanie stared at the binder as if she could will it to disappear. Rachel watched me the way you watch someone who has just lifted something you did not know was heavy until you saw it in their hands. James clicked his briefcase shut. He said he would follow up by email to confirm that the transfers had been terminated. He said he would be available if anyone had questions. He did not need to add that he expected no one to call. He stepped toward the entry, paused, and told David to take care of himself and the people under his roof. Then he let himself out. The front door closed with a soft seal, and the house settled around us. David stood and paced once from the fireplace to the window and back. He stopped in front of me and asked if I wanted water. I said no. My mouth was dry, but I wanted to feel the dryness. It made the moment real. Stephanie rose and said she had a client call. She left the room with careful steps, as if she refused to let the floorboards register her retreat. Rachel stayed seated, eyes on her hands. She said she was sorry for the way she had spoken to me at dinner. She did not dress it up or explain it. She just let the words stand. I appreciated that. David took the chair across from me and leaned forward. He said he would figure out the mortgage. He said he would call the bank today. He said he would cut back and that he would ask for help where it made sense, and that he would not hide behind pride again. He waited for me to argue. I did not. I told him I believed he could do hard things when he saw them clearly. A long quiet followed. It was not the old silence that used to erase me. It was the heavy pause after a bell is struck, the air still ringing though the clapper is still. I looked at my son and saw the boy who had once asked me to hold the back of his bicycle seat. I looked at the stairs and imagined Stephanie upstairs with her phone to her ear, building a version of events where she was the one wronged. I looked at the window and saw Rachel's reflection smaller than she expected to be. I breathed in and out until my heartbeat matched the slow tick of the clock. The room had not changed. The house had not changed. The people inside it had not magically become kinder or braver. Only one thing was different. The truth sat between us and did not move. It did not beg to be believed. It did not raise its voice. It simply weighed what it weighed. In that weight, I felt a steadiness grow, not loud, not triumphant, but certain. I understood then that no apology, no speech, no performance could add to or subtract from what had been laid bare. Facts had a gravity that words could not counterfeit. And as the afternoon light shifted across the floor, I let that gravity settle into my bones. A week later, the phone rang just after breakfast, and David answered in the clipped tone he used when he wanted to sound in control. I wiped the counter and watched his face drain as he listened. He said yes. This is David Lawson. Then he went quiet for a long stretch while his eyes tracked the calendar stuck to the refrigerator. He said, I understand the automatic transfer has been canceled. We will make the payment directly. When he hung up, he kept his hand on the handset as if it might ring again with better news. He told us the lender had called about the mortgage. The trust payment was no longer in place, and the full amount was due at the end of the week. There would be a late fee if it slipped past the grace period. He sat at the table with his laptop and opened the banking page. The numbers on the screen put a hard light on what he was willing to say out loud. He said we are short by a little more than half. He pressed his finger to the total again, as if it might change under pressure. Stephanie had been scrolling her phone. She set it down with a sigh and said she could float the difference on a card for a few days. Then she winced and corrected herself. She said the cards were not in a position to carry more. Rachel looked up quickly and then looked away. I poured coffee into a cup and carried it to the table for David. His hand shook when he reached for it. He said the lender wanted payment in full, not a partial, and that a partial would still count as late. He said he could try to move money from his 401k, but the process would take longer than the due date. He said he could ask for an advance at work, but he had never done that and did not know how it would look. He rubbed his forehead and then his jaw, a tired habit. Stephanie stood and started gathering unopened mail from a ceramic bowl by the door. She flipped an envelope and then another, then stopped and held one under the light. She said she had switched one of her cards to paperless and forgot to tell him. She opened her email on her phone and scrolled. Her voice thinned as she read. She said a payment had been declined and 2 others were past due. She said the balance across her cards was just under $40,000. The number dropped into the room and sat there between us. She said she had been waiting on reimbursements from clients and a transfer from a vendor and that the timing had been off. She kept talking, but the number did not move. David shut his eyes. He said we cannot carry that and the mortgage at the same time. He did not say how long he had suspected it. He did not say how many times he had looked away. He refreshed his email and a new message appeared from compliance at Charlotte Financial Group. He read it twice, then a third time, his lips moving without sound. He said internal audit wanted to speak with him about recurring transfers linked to a trust that did not match the household ledger. He said they wanted a meeting tomorrow morning. He looked at me as if the floor had tilted. He asked whether James could provide a letter stating the trust payments had been legitimate and independent of his work. I told him James would help. I would ask him to prepare whatever documentation was needed. Stephanie began to pace a tight path between the couch and the window. She said the audit was because of the trust and that this was exactly why secrets were dangerous. She said if we had all been on the same page, they would not be asking questions now. Her voice frayed at the end, and she pressed her lips together to hide it. Rachel took a seat at the edge of the table. She said there had to be a way to buy a few days. She suggested a cash advance from a card and then remembered the balances. She suggested asking a friend and then trailed off. No one volunteered a name. David called the lender back and asked about options. He said the person on the line could not grant an extension and that the system recognized due dates, not intentions. He repeated the date slowly, then thanked the person and hung up. He looked thinner in the afternoon light than he had that morning. I sat across from him and kept my voice even. I said James could write the letter for the audit. I said I could not pay the mortgage for them. The sentence sat in my mouth like a steady stone. I did not raise my voice. I did not apologize. I simply let the truth be what it was. He nodded a small bow of acceptance. He opened a spreadsheet and began building a plan. He listed utilities, insurance, gas, groceries. He cut subscriptions and paused on a second car payment. He said he would list the smaller car for sale if he had to. He said he would cancel the gym and the meal service. He said they would cook at home and that he would pack lunch. He said a lot of small sentences that sounded like a man pulling a rope hand over hand in the dark. Stephanie stopped pacing and stared at the screen. She said he was being extreme. She said this was a temporary squeeze and that cutting everything would create more stress. She said her studio had several pending invoices. He asked when those invoices would become cash. She looked away and said soon. The word did not anchor to anything. Rachel left for an hour and returned with grocery bags. She said she had bought the cheaper brand of everything and rolled her eyes in a way that made it half joke and half jab. She cooked pasta and sauce in silence while David called James. I listened while my son explained the email and the meeting and the line in the audit notice that had made him sweat. He asked for a letter and James said he would have it by morning. David thanked him 3 times before he hung up. We ate at the dining table without candles or music. The sound of forks on plates filled the space where conversation should have been. David said he would stop by the bank branch early and ask if there was any hardship option that did not involve ruining their credit. Stephanie said a hardship designation would be humiliating. He said humiliation was cheaper than delinquency. Rachel watched them both and drank water like it had a taste she was trying to name. After dinner, David spread statements across the table and reconciled accounts. He discovered a monthly charge for a storage unit in Stephanie's name that he had never seen. He discovered a software subscription for her studio that renewed at a premium rate. Stephanie said the storage unit held staging pieces and seasonal decor. He asked why he had not known, and she said he never asked. He let the answer pass and kept writing numbers. The phone rang again near 9. It was the lender a second time, a different voice, the same policy. David asked whether a partial would prevent a delinquency report. He listened, then said he understood. When he hung up, he said they could take a partial, but it would still report late. He said they had 3 days. The word 3 lay on the table like a deadline written in marker. Rachel offered to sell a designer bag she rarely used. Stephanie told her not to be ridiculous, then reconsidered and said maybe they should. David said he would take anything that created cash before Friday. He said he would list the second car online tonight. He said he would call a customer who owed Stephanie and sit on the phone until the payment posted. He said he would ask his manager for a half day for the audit and the bank. I cleared the plates and ran water in the sink. My hands moved through the familiar rhythm of soap and rinse while my mind stayed still. This was the first real night they had faced the house without my silent payments holding the walls in place. The sound of their problem-solving had a new pitch to it. It was not polite. It was not performative. It was real. At 10, David closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. He said he would sleep on the couch so he could keep working if he woke in the night. Stephanie said she would email clients and push them. Rachel said she would call a friend in the morning about the bag. David nodded, thanked them both, and rubbed his eyes. I walked to the doorway and paused. I told David I would be up early if he needed a ride to the bank or the office. He thanked me without looking up and said he would manage. There was no pride in his voice this time, only focus. Upstairs in my small room, the air felt different than it had a week ago. The walls were the same, the bed the same, but the quiet was not erasure anymore. It was space. Below me, the dishwasher hummed and then clicked off. A chair scraped. A faucet ran and stopped. The house was learning the sound of its own weight. I lay down and watched the ceiling until my eyes adjusted to the dark. Somewhere in the house, a phone vibrated. Somewhere, a pen scratched across a page. The mortgage would not wait. The audit would not wait. The numbers on the screen would not soften because we wished them to. For the first time since Harold died, I let those facts exist without rushing to cushion them. I folded my hands over my ribs and breathed in and out until the steady rhythm of my heart matched the patient rhythm of a clock in another room. By the time dinner rolled around the next evening, the house carried a tight, brittle quiet that felt like glass waiting to crack. David had come home from the audit with a set jaw and a stack of printouts tucked under his arm. He barely spoke as he changed out of his tie and washed his hands. Stephanie cooked in clipped motions, the pot clattering louder than it needed to her perfume sharp in the warm kitchen. Rachel drifted in and out, pretending to be helpful, setting forks down, straightening napkins that did not need straightening, her eyes restless and bright. We sat. Spaghetti again, a simple meal that tasted like cardboard when I forced the first bite down. I could feel David building toward something even before he set the papers beside his plate. He tried to make small talk about traffic on Providence Road, about the forecast, about anything that might keep the evening from sliding where it was going, but the words had no place to land. He picked up the top page and said he had gone through the statements. His voice was careful the way his voice gets when he is trying to keep the ground level. He said there were several charges from designer boutiques downtown and a series of payments to a storage facility he had never authorized. He asked Stephanie to explain the totals. He kept his eyes on the page when he said it, as if looking at her would make the question harder to ask. Stephanie set her fork down with a tap and said those were business expenses. She said her studio needed inventory staging items, samples that clients could touch. She said every designer front-loads costs and catches up when invoices clear. She reached for her wine and did not drink it, only held the glass in her fingers like it might warm if she thought hard enough. David said the balances were not temporary. He said the card interest had compounded. He said the storage unit had been running for over a year. His voice stayed even, but I could hear the fatigue under the words "a fray" that had started months ago and now showed its threads. He asked when the invoices would be paid. I asked for a date. Not soon, not eventually. A date. Rachel cut in before Stephanie answered. She said the market had been unpredictable. She said clients drag their feet. She said that was how business worked and that David was being unfair. She glanced at me as she spoke as if I were the audience that needed persuading. Stephanie added that the audit had rattled everyone and that picking apart her books tonight was not helpful. She told David he was making it sound worse than it was. She said the mortgage pressure was temporary, a bump, and that once they made it through this week, everything would align. David put the page down and finally looked at her. He said the mortgage was due in 2 days. He said there was not enough in checking to cover even half. He said he could not pull from retirement without penalties and a delay. He said they had to choose what to pay and what to delay. He said there was no room for designer inventory in a choice like that. Stephanie flushed a quick rush of color that faded just as quickly. She said, "This is what happens when family business gets aired to outsiders." She said James had humiliated them. She said I had humiliated them by involving him and letting the whole thing explode like a soap opera. She said clients gossip. She said neighbors gossip. She said the story would follow them and that I had made their life smaller. The words came at me like thrown stones. I felt the first one land and then the rest a dull thud in the center of my chest. I took one breath, then another. I told her the truth had been sitting quietly in this house for 6 years. I told her the truth had paid the mortgage while they slept. I told her the truth had not raised its voice until it had to. Then I said the line I had waited to say for years. I said the truth speaks for itself. Stephanie laughed without humor and said the truth was messy and that I did not care who got cut by it. She said respect went both ways. She said if I had wanted respect, I should have earned it by being straightforward. Rachel leaned toward her, nodding, then turned to me. She said none of this would have happened if I had moved to a senior community like everyone else's mother. She said she would be happy to help me pack when I was ready. Her smile was thin, quick, and mean. She added, looking directly at me now, that the moment I left that room would not sit empty. David snapped her name, but she pressed on. She said as soon as I left, the guest room would be hers. She said she needed a place while she figured things out, and that it made sense. She looked at Stephanie for backup. Stephanie stared at her plate and did not object. The sound in the room seemed to narrow until all I could hear was the tick of the clock and my own breath moving in and out. The pasta cooled on my plate. My hands were steady on the table, palms flat, fingers spread. I looked at David. He had gone very still, like a person realizing the ice under his feet is thinner than he thought. Then I looked at Stephanie. She would not meet my eyes, only traced the rim of her glass with a fingertip. Rachel sat back with her arms crossed, satisfied with the declaration she had made. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, not even grief. Something firmer, like the click of a lock that finally catches after years of jiggling. I pushed my chair back and stood. I told them I would be moving out sooner than planned. I told them I would not live another week in a house where my presence is a convenience to be traded or a complication to be cleared. I said I would pack my things and make arrangements. I said this calmly, each sentence a small plank laid across the gap between where I was and where I needed to be. David rose at the same time, his chair scraping loudly. He said I did not have to rush. He said we could work through this. He reached for my hand and I took it for a moment, feeling the warmth of my son there, the boy who used to tug at my sleeve when he was scared. I squeezed his fingers and then let them go. Stephanie started to speak, then changed course. She said if moving out was what I wanted, she would respect that. She said it might be best for everyone, clean lines, no confusion. She said she would text a list of dates that would be easiest for her work schedule, as if my leaving were a delivery to be coordinated. Rachel muttered that she would clear her things out of the hall closet to make room for what she called the transition. The word had a practiced ease that told me she had been thinking it for a while. I pushed my plate away and picked up my napkin. I folded it slowly, pressing the crease with my thumb. I told them I would speak with James about the logistics of my lease. I told David I would let him know my move date as soon as I had it. I told Stephanie I would leave the house as I found it in order no loose ends. I kept my voice even, polite, distant, like a stranger confirming a checkout time at a hotel. The room felt smaller when I finished speaking. Not because I had shrunk, because my presence no longer swelled to fill the gaps where others refused to stand. I walked to the sink and ran water over my plate. The rhythm of the faucet, the scrape of the fork against ceramic. The familiar sound steadied me more than any speech could have. Behind me, David said he would cover the mortgage somehow. He said he would call the bank again in the morning. He said he would talk to his manager about a short-term solution after the audit meeting. He said he would make a plan. I heard the resolve in his voice and believed it. It was the first time in a long time he had spoken as if the outcome rested on what he would do next, rather than on what someone else might rescue. Stephanie told Rachel to help her with the dishes. Rachel hesitated, then rose. As she passed behind me, she said she hoped I would not take too long with packing. I felt the words brush the back of my neck like a draft, and chose not to turn around. I dried my hands and left the kitchen. On the stairs, I could hear the clink of glasses and the soft murmur of David explaining numbers again. In my room, I closed the door and sat on the bed, the same bed that had held my sleepless nights, and whispered arguments with memory. I opened the small closet and pulled down a suitcase. The zipper rasped open, a clean sound that belonged to forward motion. I took 3 blouses from the hanger and laid them inside, then folded the cardigan Harold used to say brought out the color in my eyes. I rolled a pair of slacks, a skirt, 2 scarves. My hands moved without tremor. I pulled the shoebox from the back of the shelf, the one with his watch, and the letters he wrote me when we were newly married. I placed it in the center and tucked sweaters around it so it would not shift. The house was quieter now, or maybe it was only me. I stood still and listened. The front door opened and closed, and footsteps crossed the living room. Someone laughed once too loudly and then stopped. The clock downstairs marked time in slow, patient beats. I closed the suitcase and set it by the door. The room did not look different yet, but I felt the shape of absence forming, and it did not frighten me. I sat again on the edge of the bed and rested my palms on my knees. Tomorrow I would call James. Tomorrow I would ask Lisa at Riverside Oaks about an earlier move-in. Tomorrow I would begin to take my life out of storage. For now the house held both endings and beginnings. I breathed in the faint scent of laundry soap and old paint and let the quiet settle. I did not need anyone to bless my decision. I did not need permission to stop being the person they leaned on while pretending I was a weight. I had said what I would do. I would do it. The next morning I called James as soon as the sun cleared the maple in the front yard. My voice was steady when I asked if he had a few hours to spare. He said he would meet me at Riverside Oaks and that Lisa could show us an available unit. I packed my notebook in a folder with my identification and the last bank statement for my savings account. When I came downstairs, David was already gone, and the kitchen was quiet. I left a note on the counter that I would be out for the morning and locked the back door behind me. The drive across Charlotte felt different this time. My hands were light on the wheel, and the city looked less like a maze and more like a map. When I turned into the long entrance to Riverside Oaks, I noticed the sign first a clean white oval with dark green letters, simple and calm. The grounds were neat flower beds clipped back for fall crepe myrtles lining the sidewalks and a bench under each tree, as if the landscaper had thought not only about plants, but about people who would sit among them. James was already there when I pulled into a visitor space. He stood near the entrance with his jacket over one arm and lifted a hand when he saw me. We walked inside together. The lobby was bright and airy, high windows letting in a square of sunlight that fell across a reading nook with 2 armchairs and a small table. A notice board nearby held flyers for a book club, a weekly gardening hour, a Tai Chi class on Saturday mornings, and a welcome dinner for new residents. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a small lounge to the right. I felt something in my chest loosen. Lisa Whitaker met us at the front desk. She looked like the kind of person who remembered names the first time. She shook James's hand and greeted me with a warmth that did not feel rehearsed. She said she had a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor that had just been painted and that the previous tenant had moved to a higher care building last month, so the unit was open as soon as paperwork cleared. We took the elevator up and walked down a clean hallway with soft carpet. Lisa unlocked a door and stepped aside so I could go in first. The living room was small but bright, a wide window looking out over a courtyard where a few residents were trimming herbs and pulling browned stems from raised beds. The kitchen had new counters and a compact stove that looked easy to keep clean. The bedroom held more light than I expected, and there was a closet deeper than it looked from the door. A bathroom with a walk-in shower sat between the bedroom and the hall. Everything felt gently used and cared for, not precious but tended. Lisa pointed out the emergency pull cords, the front desk hours, the maintenance request system. She explained the monthly fee and what it covered: utilities and trash and basic cable. She said a small storage cage in the basement came with the unit. She said the building had quiet hours that residents actually respected. She said pets were allowed with a reasonable deposit and laughed when I told her my only pet would be a fern if I could keep one alive. We stood in the bedroom while she reviewed the floor plan, and I traced the space with my eyes. I pictured Harold's watch on the nightstand, my mother's quilt across the foot of the bed, the bookshelf with my paperbacks against the far wall. I imagined morning light on the small kitchen table while I drank coffee and read the paper. I could see myself walking to the garden on Tuesdays and listening more than talking for the first few weeks, then talking a little more when the faces were familiar. James watched me without speaking. He understood the moment did not need commentary. Lisa asked if I had any questions. I asked about safety, about visitor hours, about the wait list for the garden plots, about whether there was an extra fee for the chorus that met in the community room. She answered each one without rushing. When she finished, she set a thin folder on the counter and said the unit could be held with a deposit and first month's rent, and that we could complete the lease today if I was ready. I took a breath that seemed to reach the bottom of my ribs. I told her I was ready. We moved to a small office off the lobby where a glass bowl held peppermints and 2 pens waited on a blotter. Lisa slid the lease toward me section by section. I read slowly, aware of each clause. James skimmed with me, pointing at a line about early termination in case of medical need and another about guest overnight limits. Nothing surprised me. Nothing set my teeth on edge. When I finished, I signed my name. The act felt like placing a flag in ground I could finally call mine. Lisa printed a receipt when I handed over the deposit and first month's rent from my savings. The number on the page carried weight, but not the kind that dragged. It felt like a brick laid into a foundation I had been building in my mind for years. She gave me a welcome packet with a map of the property, a list of weekly activities, and a calendar taped to a card with the office phone number. She told me she could hold the keys at the front desk until move-in, and that I could start bringing boxes as early as tomorrow if I liked. She said if I needed recommendations for movers, she had a list of companies that showed up when they said they would. We toured the rest of the buildings so I could see the laundry room, the small gym with an upright bike, and a rower the library with more large print books than I expected. A gentleman sitting by the window looked up from his crossword and raised a hand in greeting. Lisa introduced him as Frank, who taught literature for decades and now ran the poetry circle on the first and third Thursdays. He smiled and said they were always looking for more ears, if not more poets. Down the hall, a woman in a denim jacket was pinning a new flyer to the board. Lisa introduced her as Eleanor, who had managed the local library for 30 years and now coordinated the book club. Eleanor said this month was a reread month and that new members were voting between persuasion and their eyes were watching God. She grinned and said she hoped the latter would win because people got livelier during the discussion. We stopped by the garden and the woman tending the rosemary asked if I cooked. I told her I used to grow tomatoes with my husband, big ones that split if we did not pick them in time. She laughed and said I should put my name down for a spring plot, even if I only grew herbs because the waiting list turned over more quickly than people thought. Lisa pointed to an empty bed near the fence and said it would likely open before March. I caught the scent of mint when a breeze moved across the leaves and felt as if I had stepped into a memory I did not have to leave. Back in the lobby, Lisa asked about timing. I told her I needed to move sooner than I had planned. She said the unit was ready now and that if I could bring a copy of my identification and proof of funds for the deposit, which I had already provided, we could mark the lease as active today and the keys would be available this afternoon. She said maintenance could swap the blinds for a lighter shade if the room felt too dim and that they could install a grab bar in the shower by Friday. James checked his watch and said he could call a moving company he trusted. He offered to stop by my storage unit and hold a few boxes at his place if I needed a buffer between here and there. I told him I would take him up on the storage help and that I could manage the rest. He nodded and said he would email Lisa a short letter confirming my tenancy for any mail change or account updates I needed to make. When the paperwork was done, Lisa handed me a small envelope with the unit number written neatly on the front. Inside was a temporary key card for the building and a metal key on a ring. The weight in my palm surprised me. It was not heavy, just precise. A simple piece of metal that let me name a place as mine. We walked out through the main doors and stood on the walkway for a moment. The courtyard was busy in a gentle way that made time feel kinder. A golf cart hummed toward the maintenance shed. Someone laughed from the lounge. The maple leaves moved in a breeze that carried the scent of cut grass. I held the key and let the picture settle in my mind. James asked if I wanted a ride back to the house or if I preferred to sit with the moment. I told him I would drive myself. I wanted the distance between here and there to register in my bones. He smiled the kind of smile that understands without prying and said he would call me later about the movers. Lisa walked us to the edge of the lot and thanked me for choosing Riverside Oaks. She said she would see me at the welcome dinner next week and that there would be lemon bars worth the trip even if I hated small talk. I laughed at that and heard the sound with a start. It had been a long time since I recognized my own laugh. We said our goodbyes, and I walked to my car with the key still warm in my hand. I sat for a moment with the door open, the afternoon sun resting on my arm, and let the air fill my lungs. I could see myself here. I could see mornings that belonged only to me, afternoons with a book and a cup of tea, evenings spent in a circle of people who knew what it was to start again. The picture did not feel like pretending. It felt like a plan. I started the engine and looked once more at the building, the windows catching light, the curve of the path that led to the garden, the bench under the crepe myrtle waiting for a person who had no schedule to keep. I closed the door and set the envelope with the key on the passenger seat. My hands rested light on the wheel. When I pulled out of the lot, the sky had cleared fully, and the day had the bright blue of early fall. Traffic moved easily on the road, and the radio hummed low without demanding attention. A smile rose before I thought to put it there. It was small and real, and it stayed as I drove, as steady as the rhythm of my breath. By late afternoon, I pulled into the driveway and saw David's car already there, parked crooked as if he had rushed inside. The front door stood ajar. From the entry, I heard the low rumble of voices in the kitchen, not yet shouting, but a current pulling in that direction. I set my purse on the console table and stepped closer, stopping just beyond the doorway so I could see without being seen. David stood at the table with a stack of papers, the same printouts from the night before, and a yellow legal pad with lines of numbers. He said they needed a plan that was not wishful. He said the first part of the plan was a spending freeze that began now. He said after the mortgage cleared, they would start financial counseling together. He kept his voice level and his shoulders squared as if he had practiced the sentences in the car. Stephanie leaned against the counter, arms crossed tight. She said counseling was an insult. She said the problem was not her spending, but the embarrassment I had caused when I dragged a lawyer into their house. She said that was the spark, and everything since had been smoke from my match. Her mouth curled when she said it, and I felt the words graze my skin, but I stayed still. David shook his head. He said the audit had nothing to do with me and that compliance asked about the trust because it was unusual, not because anyone had gossiped. He said the real issue was math. He tapped the paper. He said the studio invoices had not arrived, the card balances had grown, and the mortgage was due tomorrow. He asked her again to agree to the spending freeze, and to a financial therapist he had already researched a woman uptown who worked with couples. Stephanie's voice rose. She said he always chose his mother. She said he had been doing it for years. She said last week proved it because he sat there while I played martyr and let the lawyer make them look like beggars. She said she would not sit in a therapist's office while he and a stranger teamed up to scold her. David did not raise his voice. He said if not for me, they would have lost the house long ago. He said he was done pretending otherwise because the pretending had eaten their savings and their peace. The words landed with a dull finality that made my throat tighten. Rachel walked in then with a grocery bag of lemons and a carton of sparkling water, as if the room needed garnish. She set the bag down and announced that they were all being dramatic. She told David he was making a public spectacle out of a private bump. She told Stephanie he had no right to dictate her business decisions. Then she turned to the sink and started washing 3 glasses they did not need. David said he was not dictating, he was leading, and he should have started sooner. He said starting now, he would handle the accounts. He said all card access would run through him and that nothing would be purchased without cash or a necessity code. He said he had already created a budget on the legal pad and that they would follow it, not discuss it until it disappeared. He said the mortgage would come first, the car second, utilities, third food fourth, and that the rest would wait. He slid the pad across the table toward Stephanie. She did not touch it. She said his plan sounded like punishment. She said being treated like a child would break their marriage faster than any credit card bill. She said he should think about what kind of man lets his mother pull strings in his home and then punishes his wife for the not. The doorbell rang before he could answer. The sound startled Rachel, and she sloshed water onto the counter. David wiped his hands on a dish towel and went to the foyer. I stepped back into the hall so he would not see me standing there. A woman's voice floated in bright and professional, and David said his name. The woman said she had documents for Stephanie Lawson and needed a signature. David called into the kitchen that there was mail at the door, and Stephanie brushed past me with her chin lifted. I followed at a distance and stood by the staircase where the curve of the banister kept me out of the frame. The woman handed Stephanie an envelope and asked her to sign a small electronic pad. Stephanie thanked her in a voice that did not sound like thanks and closed the door. She tore the envelope with her thumb as she walked back to the kitchen. When she reached the table, her hand stopped. The letter hung open like a wound. She read the first paragraph twice, then the second. Her lips moved without sound. Rachel peered over her shoulder and then stepped back quickly, color draining from her face. David took the pages gently and read them in full, careful not to miss a line. He said it was a demand letter from an attorney representing a client of the studio. He said the client alleged breach of contract design specifications not met delays that caused additional costs and fixtures installed without approval. He said the letter warned of a lawsuit if they did not settle within 10 days. Stephanie said the client had been impossible, that the woman changed her mind every week and sent contradictory emails. She said the subcontractor had mismeasured the custom shelving and then tried to blame her. She said the demand was bluff and that her name would not be dragged through mud by anyone with more money than taste. David read the letter again and shook his head. He said there were attachments. He pointed to screenshots of texts and to dates that did not match the invoices. He said this was not a bluff. It was a file. He said they needed counsel and that the last thing they could afford was a public fight. He asked how many other clients were unhappy. He asked whether there were more letters coming. Stephanie gathered the pages and pressed them into a neat stack as if pressure could shrink them. She said she had 2 clients who were behind on payments because of a contractor issues, and that one had threatened a bad review. She said none of it was her fault. She said this was what he got for choosing numbers over loyalty. Rachel placed a glass in front of Stephanie with both hands like an offering. She told her sister not to panic, and then told David to calm down because panic never solved anything. She told him he was making the room worse. Her voice trembled on the last word, and she looked at me as if I had said something, though I had not spoken at all. David straightened the legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top: mortgage legal budget. He said they would transfer everything necessary to cover the mortgage by morning. He said he would schedule a consultation with an attorney for the studio this week. He said he had already booked an appointment with the financial therapist for Friday, and that he would be there whether Stephanie came or not. He said until the studio had positive cash flow, there would be no personal use of business cards and no new orders for inventory. Stephanie said he was setting her up to fail. She said a design studio without purchases was a studio without clients. She said he wanted her small so his mother could take up more space. She said it the way someone says a proof they have been waiting to reveal. He did not flinch. He said none of this was about me. He said it was about the roof over their heads and the credibility of their accounts. He said he was taking responsibility for the first time in months and that it would not feel good for a while. He said he loved her and would fight for the marriage, but he would not fight the math. Stephanie's eyes flashed and then went quiet. She said if he took control of the cards, he would have to cook as well and drive Rachel and remember birthdays and carry all the things she usually carried while he judged. He said he would do everything needed and that judgment was not the engine here survival was. I stepped into the kitchen, then not to interfere, only to clear the empty mail from the counter. The room startled slightly at my appearance, the way a flock shifts when a single bird moves. I stacked the flyers and set them by the bowl. I told David in a quiet voice, meant for his ears alone, that James would have the audit letter ready by morning and that I could pick it up if he needed me to. He nodded once and whispered thank you. The thanks was not the old kind that put me back in the shadows. It was simply a recognition of help where help made sense. Rachel reached for her bag and said she needed air. She asked if she could use the car for an hour. David said no, and that ride share would have to do. She stared at him, stunned that the old yes had turned into a new no, then left the room in a flurry of hurt and perfume. Stephanie sat down and stared at the legal pad like it was a stranger at her table. She said she would go to the Friday session. Her voice was flat, but it carried something other than defiance. She said she would call the client's attorney tomorrow and propose a walkthrough. She said she would not admit fault. David said she should not admit fault, but that she must stop arguing through email. He said he would join the call if she wanted. She did not answer. He gathered the cards and placed them in a small zippered pouch. He took the studio card and set it aside, then paused and handed it back. He said business expenses must be pre-approved and receipts uploaded weekly. She nodded once without looking up. The room exhaled not relief, but a recognition that a line had been drawn where there had only been smudges. The daylight had faded and the kitchen had gone blue around the edges. I turned on the over-sink light and rinsed 2 plates with a steadiness that surprised me. David stood and tucked the pouch into his briefcase. He said he would be up late finishing the budget and that he would send a copy to both of them. He said tomorrow they would pay the mortgage and face the bank manager without shame because the plan was in motion. He said the studio would run on paper for a while, not on hope. He walked to the doorway and paused. He looked at me and then at Stephanie. He said they were a family and that a family could survive hard seasons if they named them honestly. Then he left the room, and the sound of his steps faded down the hall. Stephanie stayed in her chair, hands folded around the demand letter. For a long moment, none of us moved. The house felt like a boat that had finally turned into the wind. It still pitched, but it had direction. I wiped the counter and set a lemon in the bowl with the others Rachel had brought. I touched its bright skin with my fingertips and thought of the key in my purse, small and certain. In the living room, David's keyboard clacked steady and precise like a metronome set to a workable pace. 2 mornings later, the key felt warm in my palm as I locked the back door of the house for what I knew would be one of the last times. My suitcase waited by the steps, and James pulled up just as the moving van turned onto the street. We loaded quietly box by box from the storage unit he had kept for me and the few things from my room that were truly mine. The rocking chair Harold repaired fit snugly against a mattress rolled in heavy plastic. The small box with his watch and our letters rode on my lap in the passenger seat like a fragile passenger that needed reassurance. Riverside Oaks looked even brighter in the late morning sun. Lisa met us at the curb and held the lobby door while the movers wheeled in the first dolly. She said the unit was ready. She said maintenance had swapped the blinds and set the thermostat to a comfortable setting. She said my name easily like it belonged here. Her calm smoothed the small tremor that still ran under my skin. We took the elevator to the 2nd floor. When the door opened, I could already smell fresh paint and a faint hint of lemon cleaner. Inside the apartment, light pooled on the new carpet. The windows faced the courtyard, and I could see two residents discussing a pot of basil as if it were a puzzle to be solved together. James helped me place the first boxes in the bedroom, and then stood back while I set the watch on the nightstand and lifted the quilt from its paper wrapping. I shook it gently and spread it across the bed. The fabric caught the light and warmed the room in a way nothing else could. The movers brought in the bookshelf and the chair. I told them the chair should go by the window and the bookshelf along the interior wall so the paperbacks would not fade. When the last box came in, Lisa handed me a small folder with a map of the building and the code for the laundry room. She pointed to the community lounge down the hall and said there was hot tea and coffee most afternoons. She said the book club gathered on Thursdays at 4 and that I would meet wonderful people there. Once the movers left, the quiet changed from empty to welcoming. James asked if I wanted him to assemble the lamp. I said I could manage, and he smiled and said he would still do it, then set to work with the small screwdriver he seemed to carry for every task. While he worked, I opened the box of photographs and propped a few on the bookshelf. Harold's grin next to a faded snapshot of David as a boy in a Little League uniform steadied me better than deep breaths ever could. When the lamp glowed to life, we both stepped back. James said the place already looked like me. He offered to go for sandwiches while I started unpacking. I told him I was not hungry yet and asked him to take the afternoon and rest. He hesitated and then said he would check on me tomorrow. Before he left, he put a copy of the audit letter on the counter and told me David had everything he needed for his meeting. He rested a hand on my shoulder and said I was not alone. I felt the truth of that land gently. After he left, I opened the window and let in a soft drift of voices from the courtyard. A knock sounded at the door, and I turned to find a woman with short silver hair and kind eyes holding a ceramic mug in both hands. She introduced herself as Eleanor from the end of the hall. She said she was on her way to the lounge for tea and wondered if I would like to join her. Her tone carried no pressure-only invitation. I said yes before I thought to be polite about it, and she smiled as if that answer pleased her more than it should. The lounge had windows on 2 sides and a round table with a jar of shortbread. Eleanor poured Earl Grey into 2 cups and asked if I had ever joined a book club. I told her I used to lead one for my 4th graders when I taught a circle of children in paperbacks and apple slices on Fridays. She said this one involved fewer apple slices and more opinions, and that I would fit in just fine. As we sipped, a tall man in a worn cardigan stopped beside our table. He introduced himself as Frank and said he ruined every book club by drifting into poetry. Eleanor rolled her eyes in an exaggerated way that made him laugh. He asked what I liked to read. I told him I had a soft spot for novels where ordinary people made brave choices quietly. He said those were his favorites too, then told me there was a poetry circle next week and that eavesdropping was allowed for newcomers who were not ready to read aloud. We sat together for almost an hour, the conversation moving easily from books to recipes to the best time to plant winter greens in our climate. They did not ask the kind of questions that pull at old wounds. They asked what I enjoyed. They asked if I liked morning walks. Eleanor said the path around the courtyard was perfect for a loop and that she did 2 every day before breakfast. Frank said the library had a copy of a memoir he thought I would like and that he would hold it for me. The kindness did not feel like charity. It felt like neighbors deciding to make room for one more chair at a table already set. In the afternoon, I visited the garden. The beds held late peppers and small rows of chard. A woman with a sun visor and a Boston accent waved me over and said her name was Ruth. She asked if I wanted to try clipping basil. I told her it had been years, and she placed the shears in my hand as if passing a memory back where it belonged. The scent rose into the warm air. Ruth said new residents could start with container herbs while they waited for a plot. She pointed to a shelf of clean terracotta pots and a bag of potting soil under the bench. She said, "Pick a pot and make it yours." So I did. I chose a small pot and filled it carefully, tucking 3 small starts of thyme into the soil. I pressed the surface flat with my fingertips and felt the grit under my nails with something like joy. Back upstairs, I made tea on my little stove and carried the cup to the window. I looked down at the courtyard where Ruth and another resident argued good-naturedly about where to move a bench for winter sun. For a long time, I simply watched. The quiet of the apartment did not feel like the old quiet that swallowed me whole. It felt like a space that held me without demands. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from David said the audit meeting had been brief and that the letter from James had cleared most questions. He said they had paid the mortgage that morning. He said he would bring me the receipt when I felt like visitors. He added a line that made me sit down. He said thank you for trusting me to handle it. I typed that I was glad to hear it and that I was settling in. I did not ask about Stephanie or Rachel. The absence of those names in his message felt like a small mercy. As evening came on, I unpacked books and slid them onto the shelf, leaving space for library finds. I tucked the shoebox with Harold's watch into the top drawer, where my hand would find it each morning without looking. I placed a single-framed photo of the farm on the dresser and set a vase with a sprig of basil on the table. The apartment changed around me in visible ways. With each small placement, a sense of belonging grew stronger. Near dusk, there was another tap at the door, and Eleanor appeared again this time with a container of chicken soup and a paper slip with the book club schedule. She said she had made too much and could not stand to freeze it. She asked if I might like company tomorrow for the welcome dinner. I told her yes, and I meant it. She said she would be by at 5 and teased that I should wear comfortable shoes because Frank told long stories when the desserts came out. After she left, I sat at the table with my bowl and felt a wave of gratitude so clean and sharp it made my eyes smart. No one here was measuring my worth against a ledger or a room assignment. No one was tallying what I cost to keep. They simply looked at me and saw a neighbor. When the sky turned deep blue, I washed the bowl, dried it, and placed it on the rack. I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dark to listen. The building settled with soft clicks. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured. In the courtyard, a sprinkler hissed to life and then stopped. The sounds formed a gentle net that held the night. I changed into an old cotton nightgown and slid under the quilt. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar from the box, and of all the years it had lived on our bed. I turned on my side and watched the rectangle of light on the ceiling shift as a car moved past outside. My body felt both tired and awake, the way a traveler feels on the first night in a safe place. There in that modest room with my books and my chair and my tiny pot of thyme on the sill, I sensed something that had been missing for a very long time. I felt seen without having to prove anything. I felt heard without raising my voice. I felt the outline of my life resolve into my own shape again. The fear that had crouched at the edge of every day loosened its hold. I closed my eyes and let the comfort of that knowledge settle. The bed cradled my weight. The window sighed with a soft breath of night air. In the quiet, I understood that I had stepped into a life that asked only this of me: be who you are and let that be enough. The next day, began with the rustle of leaves outside my window and the low murmur of voices in the courtyard as early walkers made their rounds. I brewed tea and watered the little pot of thyme on the sill. The apartment smelled faintly of basil and lemon cleaner, a humble perfume that felt like safety. By mid-morning, a text from David arrived saying the internal audit was not finished and new questions had been added about the pattern of transfers and whether any conflict disclosures should have been filed. He said he was cooperating and that the letter from James had helped, but the investigators wanted a fuller timeline. He added that he would stop by Saturday like always. Saturday came with Carolina's sun and a soft breeze. David appeared at my door with 2 coffees, the budget notebook under his arm, and a tired resolve in his eyes. He said the audit team had extended their review and would be interviewing his manager next. He admitted he was afraid. I listened without trying to fix it. We walked the courtyard path twice while he told me how he had closed the studio card, cut every non-essential draft, and set up an account that paid only the mortgage and utilities. He said the house felt different in the evenings, quieter, not better or worse, only honest. On the bench by the crepe myrtle, he handed me a printed photo of the basil he and I had clipped years ago behind the old farmhouse. He said he had found it in a shoebox when he finally opened the hall closet I had kept tidy. The gesture landed gently and stayed all afternoon. The following week, the first real crack in Stephanie's work appeared in the public square. A client posted a long account on a neighborhood forum, carefully worded but unmistakable. Missed deadlines, wrong fixtures, costly corrections, and a demand letter ignored. I heard about it from Eleanor, who mentioned it with the careful tone a kind person uses when sharing news that might touch a bruise. Later that day, David texted to say the post was accurate and that the client's attorney had filed suit after Stephanie refused to settle. He said the studio lease would not be renewed and that Stephanie had told her assistant to seek other work. He did not gloat. He sounded like a man watching a storm he had tried to outrun. Rachel came by Riverside Oaks once unannounced on a windy afternoon. She stood in my doorway with a nervous smile and new luggage tags on her tote. She said she had accepted a short-term position in Raleigh and would be leaving Charlotte by the end of the month. She spoke briskly about a friend's couch and a probable sublet, then faltered. She said she had been careless and unkind, and that distance might help her change the way she spoke before she thought. I wished her steadiness and safe travels and meant both. When she left, she hugged me quickly as if testing whether such a thing fit between us, and then hurried down the hall. At Riverside Oaks, the days unfolded in a simple rhythm that stitched me back together. I learned the names of the morning walkers and the favorite benches of the chess players. I helped Ruth move her rosemary inside when the forecast threatened a cold snap. Frank pressed a thin book of poems into my hands and told me to read the last one out loud to myself before bed. Eleanor knocked on my door for tea on Thursdays, and we traded stories the way neighbors trade recipes, no judgment, only methods that have worked in one kitchen or another. David's visits became their own ritual. He came every weekend, sometimes on Saturdays, sometimes Sundays after church, always with coffee and sometimes a sack of peaches from a roadside stand. He brought small updates about the audit, never dramatized, only facts in a notebook hand. He said his manager had been supportive, but cautious that compliance teams could drag a net wide before pulling it in. He said he had stopped sleeping on the couch and now turned off the screens by 10, then ran at dawn to clear his head. I heard a new steadiness in him, not loud, not proud, simply present. He began to ask about books I was reading. He stayed longer each time. News of Stephanie traveled in fragments. The studio's sign came down. The landlord changed the locks. The lawsuit moved into discovery, and her attorney advised silence on social media. The designer friends fell quiet or drifted away. A second demand letter arrived from a different client with a polite but firm threat of a formal complaint if repairs were not funded within 30 days. David said he had asked her to meet the financial therapist again, and she had gone tight-lipped, but on time 2 sessions in a row. He said the counselor had assigned them both a task to name one thing they valued in the other that had nothing to do with money. He named her eye for color and the way she made rooms glow. He said he was trying. Late winter bent toward spring. In the courtyard, the raised beds softened and greened. Tiny shoots pushed through soil like shy promises. I added parsley to the sill and placed a small bowl of lemons on the table. When the welcome dinner came around again, I stood at the buffet with Eleanor and recognized faces I had learned to love. We listened to Frank tell a story that started with frost dates and ended with a sonnet. I laughed easily and felt the sound settle in my chest, like a bird finding a good branch. One Sunday afternoon, David arrived without the usual notebook. He looked tired but lighter. He said the audit had closed with a written caution about documentation and a recommendation for a refresher training on reporting outside financial relationships, even benign ones. He said there would be no disciplinary action and no note in his file beyond the general memo sent to the whole team. He sat on the edge of the chair and let the news rest between us like a stone that did not need further shaping. We walked the path twice in grateful silence. Stephanie's path bent a different way. The suit advanced and then settled for an amount that made her wince. She shut the studio for good and boxed the samples. The credit card balances did not disappear, but they stopped growing. She kept her next therapy appointment. She asked David to handle the next batch of invoices and did not fight when he changed a vendor. At home, she let the rooms be simple. The silence there became less like glass and more like wood, ordinary and workable. We did not become close. We became civil, which felt like a kind of peace. Rachel sent a postcard from Raleigh with a picture of a downtown mural and a crooked line that said she had found a reasonable sublet and a steadier voice. I wished her well from my kitchen table and slipped the card into a drawer. Spring came fully. The courtyard broke into bloom and bees threaded the air. On a Tuesday morning, Frank asked me to read a poem aloud to the group, and I did. My hands barely shook. Eleanor insisted I keep the book a few extra days, and I did that too. After lunch, I watered the thyme and opened the window wider. Somewhere a radio played a slow old song that smelled like summer. David arrived that weekend with a small tray of seedlings he had started in paper cups. He said the garden coordinator had found me a real plot near the fence line. We walked down together and knelt in the dirt. He pressed a cherry tomato into place while I tucked in marigolds at the corners like cheerful guards. We did not talk much. We did not need to. When we finished, we sat on the edge of the bed with soil on our knees and the sun on our faces. He said he had missed this. I said I had too. It was the truest thing either of us had said all week. In the quiet of my apartment that evening, I set a vase of cut tulips on the table and brewed tea. I sat by the window and watched the light thin over the courtyard. The maple moved just enough to make a shushing sound that reminded me of Harold's hand smoothing my hair when the world felt too loud. I thought of the house across town, of the rooms that had held my sorrow and my patience and my leaving. I thought of the woman I had been there and the woman I was now. They were both me, but only one of them breathed easily. They had called me a burden. Now they understood the truth that a benefactor does not need a title. I asked nothing but this small thing I hold in my hands each morning and set gently down each night. I asked only for peace. If you were standing where I once stood, would you keep giving until you vanished, or would you choose the door that leads into a life shaped like your own name?